Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. And this time we're going to look at how Richard III seized the throne in 1483. Last time, you remember, we kind of wrapped up the story of George, Duke of Clarence, and his erratic career, I guess, controversial career as brother of Edward IV, if you can have a career as a brother. And we looked at why perhaps Edward ran out of patience with George in the late 1470s. It's fair to say that the death of George Duke of Clarence, the execution of George Duke of Clarence, did cost Edward IV popularity points. There was quite a lot of disquiet over how that had happened. But it does remove a problem for Edward, a big problem, and an ongoing problem too. And it seemed to stabilise things in the kingdom. Now Edward just had one brother left, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and he was the loyal brother. He had fought with Edward at Barnet in 1471 against Warwick. He had led the war against the Scots in 1480 and successfully gained Berwick back from the Scots in 1482. And as a result of all this, he had been basically given control of the north of England by Edward IV, and arguably by the early 1480s, Richard has greater power and influence than Warwick had had in the start, in the 1460s, at the start of Edward IV's reign. He is loyal, he has proved his usefulness, and he's completely trusted. Having said that, and maybe because of that, Richard does seem to have had a relationship of distrust, mistrust with the Woodvilles. It's notable, for example, that Richard rarely went to court in the last 4 years of Edward IV's reign. Nevertheless, there wasn't really a problem visible on the horizon. And perhaps that's because the horizon didn't look like it was going to feature Edward IV's death when it did. He died in April 1483. We don't know the causes of his death, although it's fair to say he had a pretty unhealthy lifestyle. So perhaps in retrospect shouldn't be that surprising. Most accounts agree there were natural causes. In any case, it's not like debated that it's a murder or skullduggery or anything like that. But it is significant that Edward IV's death was unexpected. It happened after only 10 days of illness on the 9th of April 1483. And what this meant was that preparations hadn't been kind of pinned down. They'd been perhaps vaguely sketched out. People knew what might happen if Edward died, but they hadn't really thought through exactly what would happen. And Edward himself hadn't said whether his son, 12-year-old Edward, should be crowned immediately and helped to rule by a royal council in the few years before he became an adult, at around 15, or whether in that interim a protector should be formally appointed to run the show until Edward was old enough to be crowned and take over as Edward V. When Edward IV died, Richard was up north, and it probably took a couple of weeks maybe for Richard to find out. And it seems like in that time a Woodville plan was hatched or developed to get Edward V, as we'll call him, to London and have him crowned quickly. Then Edward V, of course, could appoint his own council, and that would lead to continued Woodville influence and dominance. And this was kind of baked in because at that time Edward was in Ludlow with his uncle Anthony Woodville, and trust and familial relationships would mean that the Woodvilles would continue to be the force in England. We can see this as kind of a plot to take over control of England, but it could be as much about self-preservation as anything else. It's undebatable that the Woodvilles were unpopular in England, and we don't really need to understand whether that's legitimate or justifiable or not, whether kind of the rumours were just about jealousy. What we can be certain of is that they needed to kind of act against that. It was a sort of eat or be eaten position for them, perhaps. Anyhow, because of this plan kind of unveiling, William Lord Hastings, a close advisor of Edward IV, advised Richard to get himself to court as quickly as possible. And so when Edward, of course, who's in Ludlow with Anthony Woodville, is on his way to London, he is actually intercepted by Richard of Gloucester and the Duke of Buckingham at a place called Stony Stratford, which is just outside what's now Milton Keynes, kind of halfway-ish between Birmingham and London. The two groups seem to have met up and had a fairly kind of friendly, convivial evening of chat and laughter and fun and drinking. But the following morning, Richard acted ruthlessly against the entourage of the heir to the throne. Anthony Woodville, Sir Richard Grey, who was one of Elizabeth Woodville's sons by her first marriage, and Sir Thomas Vaughan were all arrested, placed in custody, and Richard of Gloucester, Duke of Buckingham, took over the march to London with little Edward V. Perhaps sensing what was coming as a result, Elizabeth Woodville chose to move herself and her children into Westminster Abbey, or the environs of Westminster Abbey, to claim sanctuary, along with, crucially, her younger son, Richard. So on the 4th of May, Richard enters London with Edward in tow and claims the title of Protector. So this is the second of the two options. He is going to claim the title of Protector, run England for the next 3 years, and then hand over control fully to Edward V. This seems to have been accepted by the Royal Council at the time, although it is missing a few members because they've been arrested in Stony Stratford. And having said that, it's notable that Richard isn't able to move straight away, or doesn't want to move straight away, to execute those people that he'd arrested, Anthony Woodville, Thomas Vaughan, Richard Grey, which shows that support wasn't absolute, or the story wasn't kind of completely convincing. He is needing to win people over rather than buying into a plot that's already kind of assumed. Richard puts little Edward in the Tower of London. That's not particularly unusual, but of course has slightly more ominous tones, given that we'll know what happened later on. And then you've got a kind of a slightly confusing narrative of events through June and July. And what we're trying to pick out here is, at what point do we think that Richard decided to take control of the throne, decided to usurp Edward V? Is it a late decision provoked by events and an opposition, or is it an early decision that he then kind of cunningly puts into train? So here are the events, and we'll come back also to the significance of Richard's seizing the throne in a few minutes. On the 9th of June, the Royal Council met to discuss the cost of Edward V's coronation. Although it had been delayed, at that point it seems like they still expected it to happen. 4 days later, on the 13th of June, William Lord Hastings was arrested and accused of plotting against Richard with the Woodvilles. At the same time, Thomas Lord Stanley, the Bishop of Ely, and the Archbishop of York are also arrested and removed from the Royal Council. Bishop of Ely, Lord Stanley, and Archbishop of York are all later released, but after a brief trial, William Lord Hastings was executed. He had been one of Edward IV's biggest supporters, and the move was widely seen as being unjustified. Remember, Lord Hastings was the person who had contacted Richard and said, "Come south quick," before they put in place a Royal Council that squeezes you out. It's unclear to us whether they had been plotting against Richard. Perhaps they fear now that Richard is moving towards usurping Edward V, and that they were prepared to back him initially, but now they're worried, actually, we've backed someone who is turning out to be more ambitious and more monstrous than we had perhaps anticipated. Maybe. Either way, this is kind of a sign that things have moved along, and the Royal Council now has been stripped away of those people who were less enthusiastic about Richard. It's therefore super surprising, 3 days later on the 16th of June, that Elizabeth Woodville agreed to give up her younger son Richard from the sanctuary in Westminster Abbey so that he could join his brother in the Tower of London. This was asked for so that Richard could take part in preparations and rehearsals for the coronation. And it is only given after personal reassurances by the Bishop of Lincoln and the Archbishop of Canterbury that they would be safe. The Archbishop of Canterbury gives his personal guarantee that Richard will be safe. He had been pressured into that, no doubt. It is seen to be surprising. Elizabeth Woodville does get quite a lot of stick for it. Because immediately Richard then delays the coronation till the 9th of November, and less than a week later, on the 22nd of June, the Duke of Buckingham and Dr. Ralph Shaw both publicly support Richard's claim to the throne, arguing that Edward IV was illegitimate and also that his marriage to Elizabeth was invalid because he had already been pre-contracted to another woman. This results in a petition, whether contrived or not, we're not sure, a petition calling on Richard to assume the throne. 3 days after that, on the 25th of June, Anthony Woodville, also known as Earl Rivers, Richard Grey and Thomas Vaughan, who'd been arrested at Stony Stratford, are executed in Pontefract, where they'd been taken, accused of plotting to remove Richard as protector and install the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, as protector instead. Now, quite how they were doing that while they were under lock and key, I'm not sure. But the point is that they're removed permanently from being potential opposition to Richard. On the following day, 26th of June, Richard declared himself king, and he was crowned on the 6th of July after a speedy coronation, despite all the problems, apparently, in getting ready for a coronation for little Edward. There were no obvious protests at the coronation. There's quite a bit of continuity in government posts. Not everyone at the time thought this was a bad idea. This is a usurpation, but with some latent support. Richard and Anne and then went off on procession around the south and up to the north, trying to look the part, act the part of king and queen, and doing a decent job of it. And we'll come back to kind of how the reign goes in the next episode. But for now, we'll just finish off with what is the significance of Richard taking the throne. Well, first of all, he's less legitimate as the next ruler after Edward IV than Edward V, who still gets name and title as a sort of very short uncrowned king. So therefore, he makes the country less stable by taking on that role than he would have done if he had been protector or if there'd been a royal council. The significance of Richard taking power is also that he's supported in the north, and that's good, but it did make it harder for him to get support in the south. He's seen as being a northern imposter, I guess, on the throne. Third bit of significance is that it conflicts those supporters of Edward IV. They might not have, like Lord Hastings, I think, they might not have wanted Woodville dominance and were prepared to go along with Richard as protector, but it doesn't mean that they wanted him as king instead, and certainly not at the expense of the son Edward. Of course, one of the significances, therefore, is what to do with these two princes that are locked up in the tower. We'll come back to that next time. Edward and Richard are in there, 12-year-old and his younger brother. And after that situation is resolved, the Tudor threat, which is quite small at this time, grows because Henry Tudor in exile in Brittany is becoming the only kind of Lancastrian hope. Having said that, one positive significance is that Woodville influence is reduced. I'd say positive, like from some people's perspective, the Woodville influence is reduced by Richard taking control, and there is an adult on the throne, and that is a good thing in medieval, I was say England, medieval Europe, I suppose, because that in itself should be more stable. And Richard was a good administrator, as we've seen, a successful military commander. So there are upsides to it as well. However, as you probably know already, it all goes quite wrong quite quickly. And we'll think about that next time and perhaps do a bit of comparison between Richard and his brother Edward IV. Thanks so much. See you then.